This is Join Us in France, episode 339. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we look around France so you can best enjoy France as a destination. We talk about French culture, history, gastronomy, and everything it takes to have a meaningful experience in France. Today, I bring you a conversation with Dr. Rebecca Rogers about the education of girls in France. Dr. Rogers is a professor at the Université de Paris and conducts research under the banner of the CNRS. That's a major research entity in France. Her specialty is the history of education. She earned her first degree at Harvard, and then she came to France for her DEA and doctoral degrees. And then she moved back to the US to teach at the University of Iowa and back to France for much of her career. I first heard her on Le Cours de l'Histoire, which is a radio show on France Culture, where she was a guest as a major expert in the field of the education of girls in France. I thought I'd love to talk to her, so I reached out and she graciously accepted. We had a great time chatting about her life with one foot in America and the other in France, and also, of course, talk about the education of girls in France and where you might go to see some of the places of education of girls in French history. If you like what we do here at Join Us in France, consider supporting us by visiting joinusinfrance.com/boutique to check out my books, tours, and services, such as my itinerary review, where I help you craft the best vacation in France specifically for you. The best way to stay in touch with me and with the podcast is to sign up for the newsletter at joinusinfrance.com/newsletter. Bonjour, Rebecca Rogers, and welcome to Join Us in France.
Hello, Anna Sargent. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you.
Today, I mean, it's a privilege for me to welcome you, Dr. Rebecca Rogers. I first heard you on a wonderful French history radio show and podcast called Le Cours de l'Histoire. It was a few weeks ago, and they explained that you're a professor at the Paris Descartes University. And I thought, how wonderful, an academic who speaks both French and English. I wonder if she'd come on the podcast. And here you are. So thank you so much.
Well, I hope your listeners will find it interesting as well. Then.
I'm sure they will. I'm going to post links to your impressive career and publications and all that on the show notes for this episode. You went to Harvard, CNRS, which means a lot to French people, Paris Descartes. Now you are way up there when it comes to credentials. So it's wonderful to have you. Your studies have centered on the education of girls in France, and we'll definitely get into that. But I would like to start with your own unusual education. You grew up kind of in between France and the US, didn't you?
Well, my mother was French, but had left in 1941 during the war. And I think she spent all of her adult life trying to ensure that her family, and especially her daughters, would feel a real connection to France. And that meant, speaking French to us over breakfast, for example, and making every effort possible to bring us to France in the summer.
Wow. Yeah. And so you started coming to France when you were pretty young.
Yeah, my first visit was when I was 5, but I think France got into my blood when I was 11, when my parents decided to spend a semester in France, and they plopped my sister and I in a girls' school because schools were still segregated by sex, and they were not coeducational.
So that was 1960.
That was 1970. Actually.
1970. Okay.
Yeah, and we were in a primary school where there were just other girls. And we really didn't know much French because those conversations over breakfast allowed us to have, conversations about food, for instance, and thank you and that sort of thing, but not much more.
Yeah, that's
And
funny
suddenly,
because I started school probably in '69, and all I can remember is mixed school
well,
in Toulouse.
Depends very much where you were.
Yeah,
Paris is a big enough city that they could maintain single-sex
right,
institutions,
right.
which would quickly have become coeducational afterwards.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was not It was not coeducational.
Right. So that must have been a really very different experience for you from what you had done in America.
Very different experience, and where for somebody who was a good student like myself, what was useful is that there was so much rote learning. So we memorized our math lessons, and we memorized our geography lessons, and we memorized our history lessons, and I was able to do that without understanding really what I was saying. But after a while, you learn.
Yeah.
I mean, and of course, it's a lot easier when you're 10 than when you're an adult.
Yes, I would bet within a year you were completely bilingual.
Well,
oh, you didn't stay a year, did you?
We didn't spend. I mean, I was pretty good, but I've never. I mean, what I didn't get from that was to become completely bilingual in terms of writing. So French grammar remains a struggle for me, and I still have somebody read my French texts. Somebody always who's a native French person will correct them.
Yeah. Well, your French is excellent. I mean, I could tell you weren't French, born and raised, but it's very subtle. I mean, you're really, really way up there, so good for you to understand. I mean, especially in academia, you do have to make sure your French is good too. I mean, obviously.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
And respect the proper gender, especially when you're a gender historian, which is my case.
Yes, we have strange genders for things that you would think they would be feminine or masculine, but they're not. Who knows?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And so then you specialized in history. You did a bachelor's, I think, at Harvard in history.
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
And then you came back to France after your bachelor's.
Yes, I really. I initially came back to France thinking I was just going to spend some time working and get a better sense of the city and of the country outside of summers. And things didn't quite work out that way. And I got hit by a car, broke my leg. And I ended up deciding it was a lot more comfortable to be studying again. And one of the things I had learned was that French higher education is, for an American especially, practically free.
Right.
And so I convinced a scholar that I had that my 4 years at Harvard was worth a maîtrise in France. And
I bet,
that he accepted to take me on as a doctoral student. And that sort of launched something which I certainly never suspected would be such a long-term love affair with the country.
Yeah. So how did you get interested in the education of girls, particularly?
Well, I think it always surprises people that it wasn't a sort of feminist decision that I wanted to, work on girls because there was less work being done on girls. And it really wasn't initially. My initial instinct was that education is really the key to learning, to understanding a society. And that was really at the year I spent in France trying to work, mostly, teaching English and being a babysitter. I realized just to what extent the education I had sort of forged certain attitudes about work, about life, about how you organize your life, and that my peers just didn't have those same reactions, that we really had very different visions of the world that at the time, and I was 21, I was convinced was because of education. And so I decided I wanted to work on education. And it was my advisor who said, and what about working on girls' education? I said, why not?
Why not? Yeah.
and it's a choice that I am so thankful to him to have suggested that, because it really, I mean, I had always been interested in history, but it became so much more important once there was really a connection to thinking about the place of women in society and how education forges that position, but also opens opportunities for women. And especially if you look in the past, it's just you get an opportunity for education that opens doors. It changes completely your life.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me because I kind of had the opposite parcours, or whatever you want to call it. I was born and raised in France, and then I went to the US for college, and I met a lovely young man that I'm still married to, and his family has a lot more education than mine. And I was flabbergasted that his grandmother had a master's degree and had been teaching at a university, because on my side, I was the first one to even get a baccalaureate, so that's very different.
That really rings. I mean, it really is very similar to my situation, because both of my grandparents, my grandmother had a master's degree, and my grandfather had a doctorate from Johns Hopkins, actually. And I don't meet anybody in France who has, both of my parents did PhDs, that they're very, very different.
Absolutely. It is so rare. Yes, it's so rare in France to have families where, especially women had a high level of education 100 years ago, or had their education 100 years ago. That is almost unknown in French everyday, just meeting normal French families. Sure. I'm sure if you start talking to maybe more aristocracy, things like that, possibly. I don't roll with these these people so much, but anyway, it's really interesting to me that it seems to me like in America, the education of women has been a bigger deal for a longer time. Sure. Let's put it that way.
I just gave a talk on that, where, you really see, beginning in the end of the 18th century, the moment of independence, education from the outset is considered absolutely key for women to assume what a scholar has referred to as this role as a Republican mother.
Right.
And that ideal you will find 100 years later in France. The idea that you should educate women because they are the mothers of citizens. So you already see.
So you would say it started around when in France?
Well, I would say that the revolution, as always, starts a very vibrant conversation about education in general, because whenever a revolutionary moment really involves rethinking society, and that means rethinking education. And so there are lots of debates about education in general, but also about, what place do we give to women? And so there are, more conservative moments, and then there are more radical moments. But you do have in 1791, Condorcet, great philosopher, making this plea that women should have the advantage of the same education as men. And he gives a series of arguments. And he starts with more conventional arguments, because women are mothers and they will raise their children, and it's important. And because women are also the companions of their spouses, and you need to have somebody with whom you can communicate. And then his final argument is, but they're, basically they have the right as human beings to have the same education as boys. So you have that voice already during the revolution, but it will take a very long time for that voice to be heard. It will be taken up by women in particular throughout the 19th century. But even when there's the great reforms of education that creates a sort of democratic system in the 1880s, a democratic and a secular school system, there are speeches about the equality of education, which where equality does refer to equality between the social classes and equality between the sexes, but at the same time you create a strictly segregated by sex educational system.
Mm-hmm.
And especially for the middle classes, what is proposed for girls is different from what one proposes for men. And in particular, it doesn't open up the doors to the university, which is one of the reasons we have so few, grandmothers or great-grandmothers who went to the university, because even if they had the opportunity to study in a high school, which only a minority of people did, they wouldn't have been able to prepare the baccalaureate, which allows you to continue your studies.
Yeah. I forgot the name of the first French woman to do a baccalaureate.
That was Julie Victoire Daubier.
Yeah, oui,
and so she does that. She gets her baccalaureate in 1861, but before there are any schools that actually prepare girls for the baccalaureate. So she has the great good fortune to have an educated family, and especially brothers and uncles who will give her the Latin and the Greek that she needs in order to be able to pass that exam. But she will spend her life fighting for women's access to a serious education that allows them to have jobs that are qualified, and criticizing the discriminations that women have in both the educational and the working world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, recently there was an adorable story in French news about this lady who was I think she was 98 when she finally took the baccalaureate, because she had been denied when she was younger. She, for reasons that I don't remember, she hadn't been able to do it when she was younger. And then she had raised children and done all sorts of things. But when she got older, she said, I'm going to do it. And she finally did it as a candidat libre, which means she didn't go to school. She just took the exam by herself. Yeah. So I imagine myself, a young kid, going to take my philosophy part of the baccalaureate. And this old lady comes in to take the exam. That must have been quite the woman. Anyway, yeah, it's really striking how long it took for the culture to accept women into, academia. It took forever. It's not that long ago, Yeah. And so,
and in France, we're very admiring of Marie Curie, because she won, 2 Nobel Prizes in both physics and in chemistry at the beginning of the 20th century, and she was the first woman to have a position as a professor at the Sorbonne in 1906. But then you have to wait decades and decades before another woman does. And she's, Marie Curie is herself a Polish woman who fled Poland to do her studies in France, and it's very exceptional.
Yes,
and so you really have to.
Even for her, I think they only offered her the class to teach, to be a full professor, after her husband had died.
Yes, exactly.
So it's just nuts.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons that you see so few women in academia in France is also because there's just no tradition, like in the United States, of single-sex women's colleges. And that is, an opportunity for women in the United States or in Britain, where you also had women's colleges, where in these women's colleges, you could have men who taught, but it wasn't a real opportunity for women to teach and to have careers as teachers. Much more difficult in the United States in the traditional Ivy League schools. You wait well past World War II for women to get positions at the Princetons and the Harvards of this world. But in France, you don't have any of those institutions. So basically, women enter teaching careers in the university. It really starts to begin in the 1970s, which is yesterday.
So France was late to the party, obviously, like we often usually are in most things, but there was, I think, an effort to educate girls, at least give all girls an elementary education. Would you say that that's true?
Definitely, and it also begins well before the Republican state, mandates that. The state mandates that in the early 1880s in France. But beginning with the counter-reform in the 16th century, you have institutions for both boys and girls from the outset, in part because it is considered very important for women to have an education because they are the mothers of, young children, and that you don't want, and that be it religious messages that you want these women to pass on, or moral lessons, or lessons about, the sort of person you should be in the world. French believed pretty strongly in the importance of having an education, be it progressive or more conservative.
Right.
And so there's centuries of, girls' schools. Girls' schools have been in existence for centuries in France.
Yeah, I think it comes from, Jules Ferry and Paul Bert, these types of reformers. I think they really believed that girls had just as much right to elementary education as boys did, and
sure. Yes.
And I think that's where France did okay by the population, because you really need to have women who can read and write, and and to take care of your kids. Even like the doctor gives you instructions of how to give medication. Well, it's really helpful if you can read the prescription or whatever. Maybe it's silly. Maybe it's a silly example, but I think it's really important to educate women as much as possible.
Well, I think that's. It's actually. There's plenty of evidence showing that by the end of the 19th century, the population wants to be educated. Its families are sending their children to schools, and that's the most important. You can have laws that tell you have to go until families believe that it's necessary, that it's useful and necessary.
Right.
You'll have a hard time ensuring that the schools really have much of an impact, and that. By the 1870s in France, much of French society, perhaps not the most rural areas, but much of French society is convinced that it's useful and necessary. So.
Yeah, and it was free also because there are some countries where even elementary school was not free, and in France it has been for a long time. So that helps.
Yeah, with the fairy laws, they're free. But even before then, it's possible to it's often possible to get free education. But it's true that the relationship to the cost of education is very different in France.
Yeah. So at lunch, I was telling my husband that I was going to be talking with you, and he brought up this idea that I'm not sure if he's right or not. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that by now we have more women than men with professional degrees? Like he was saying, he thinks that we have more women doctors than men doctors in France, and veterinarians and professions like that.
Not sure about the situation in the professional world. What is certainly true is that we're producing more. We're producing more women doctors and women lawyers now than men. The French university has about the student population is about 2/3 women to 1/3 men.
Oh wow!
And it's very striking in the professions like law and medicine that's the same. That's the same proportion.
Right.
And so it is. And so obviously I don't know the figures for doctors today, but it's obvious that that's going to have an impact.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And my daughter is just entering the professional world now, and she's a software person, and there are very few women, very few women.
There's very few. But it's in that area and in sports studies that there's very few women.
Yeah.
And in math.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose a little bit in physics, but otherwise it's, in the sort of, more general studies, women are really very dominant.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about a few places that you might want to go visit if you're interested in, things you need to pay attention to when you're visiting France. One person that you mentioned earlier is Condorcet. If you walk along the banks of the river, not very far from Ile de la Cité, in Paris, on the side where the money museum is.
Yes.
L'Hôtel de la Monnaie, whatever. There's a magnificent statue of Condorcet right there. And he's just open arms, and he seems like he's teaching,
Wow.
it's a beautiful place to stop and think about what he's brought to French culture, because he was definitely one of the more interesting people. And obviously everywhere in France, we have these, in the cities, you have école des garçons, école des filles. And they have not removed those. I mean, those are usually engraved in stone. And by now they're co-ed schools, obviously. But you will see that everywhere you go. In Paris, every few streets, you'll find a building where it says École des filles, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think you'd find it in many small villages also, that had a little bit of money to have an engraving on the frontispiece of their school. You will see École des filles, École de garçons. It's often the same building, but a sort of separate entrance.
Right.
Because we're very careful then to separate them in the recreational areas back behind.
Yes. Yes. And see, I have never, and I realized that I was one of the first generations to be in a co-ed kind of situation. But I never went to a
single sex.
Yeah, no. But my mom did, and
yes,
yeah, her whole school years was in single sex. So
I think it's one of the biggest differences between the United States and France is that sort of history of coeducation, which came very early in the United States and came very late in France.
Right. So tell us a little bit about the Maison d'éducation de la Légion d'honneur, which is what you wrote your dissertation about, because that's not something I know very much about, and I would love to hear from you.
Okay. Well, it was a wonderful dissertation topic. I didn't know anything about them either when I began working on them. But they were schools that Napoleon set up for the daughters of his servitors, so mostly men in the army, who he wanted to be able to offer them something because he'd created schools for the sons of his servitors, and so basically the Legion of Honor is this medal you get for serving the state. And so he opened these institutions for the daughters of men who had been given this medal because they had been given the Legion of Honor. So from the outset, what's interesting about it is that it's an institution that welcomes girls who are from all different social origins, because the Legion of Honor is given on merit and devotion to the state. So you can be a soldier who gets it, and you can be a general who gets it, and it is mostly the daughters of military men who work, because it is the Napoleonic Wars after all when they're created.
Yeah.
It's this social mixture of girls. And because he's Napoleon, and because he wants the schools to be a model in France, and he wants to be recognized for this generosity in terms of supporting education for girls' schools, he settles on these institutions where they can take in several hundred girls. They're boarders, and they'll be educated for 4 to 6 years. And he, from the outset wants it to be a serious education, but in Napoleon's vision, this education is supposed to be directed towards, religious messages and making good wives and mothers.
Right. I think Napoleon had a definite opinion that women should be pretty and be moms.
Yes, exactly. And so he has very explicit instructions about what he wants for the girls who are in these institutions, and in particular, he says, I don't want des femmes savantes, he wants, or des raisonneuses, women who reason, he wants modest, docile women, basically.
Oy.
But he's not the one teaching in these schools, and he chooses to put at the head of the first school that he opens in Écouen, which is in the north of Paris and is now the Museum of the Renaissance. He chooses Madame Campan, Jeanne Henriette Campan, who had been the first reader of Marie Antoinette, and had managed to not get guillotined during the Revolution, and on the contrary had actually opened a school in Saint-Germain-en-Laye for ambitious, families who had sort of ambitious and intellectual girls in many ways. And in this institution, she had as her students two of the sisters of Napoleon, but also Eliza Monroe, who would go on to, so the daughter of the future President Monroe of the United States.
Oh wow!
And so who remained very devoted to Madame Campan. And I recently read a very interesting undergraduate thesis about the reputation of Madame Campan throughout the 19th century in the United States, thanks to Eliza Monroe, whose mother dies rather early, and so she sort of takes the place of her mother as sort of the president's, wife in a way, in the United States, and does a great deal to tout the horn of Madame Campan, particularly the textbooks that she wrote on girls' education, which were translated into English.
How interesting! Yes, her name comes up quite a bit in French history, Madame Campan. She was influential, to say the least.
She's an intellectual, she's an educator, and she's an astute political strategist, I would say. And so she needs to. Her own husband doesn't support her, and so she ends up. She needs to have this role. First in the royal court, then running this very prestigious school, and then when she's appointed at the head of the school at Écouen. This really gives her ideas of grandeur. I mean, she in the early 19th century is saying that she wants her school to become a sort of university for women, a university where you'll train women who will set up schools throughout France and the French Empire. And she writes these projects. She produces all of these plans that she sends to Hortense Beauharnais, who had been her student, and who is the wife of
Madame de Beauharnais,
up in the Low Countries, as we call them, in sort of Belgium, and so she's writing these projects to somebody who she thinks has the ear of who's the stepdaughter of Napoleon. And while these more grandiose objectives to create a University of Women doesn't work, the schools of the Legion of Honor do survive the fall of the empire. She doesn't remain in place, Madame Campan herself, but the schools remain a model for serious girls' education throughout the 19th century. And they still exist today, and they have the best results in the baccalaureate in all of France, and they remain girls' schools, which is quite unusual for institutions that are supported by the state. They're an institution in France, but they were, now we have all sorts of good schools, whereas in throughout much of the 19th century, they're a real model in terms of what they offer, and also, for the women who are teaching within them.
So how many are there of these schools, Maison d'éducation de la Légion d'honneur? How many are there?
Well, he founded sort of two that were considered sort of more superior, des Maisons Impériales Napoleon, they're called at the time. And then he decided to create six other, Maisons d'Orphelines, that was supposed to be, welcoming more impoverished girls. In the end, only three will survive after the fall of the empire. There's one, and the one that is, only two function today. But the one that is perhaps the most prestigious is now Saint-Denis, which is up in the northern suburbs, and it's right next to the Basilique de Saint-Denis, where the kings of France are buried, and it's a very impressive building. I mean, when I was doing my dissertation, I was working in the basement, where I would hear the bells of the Basilique, l'Abbaye de Saint-Denis. Sorry, not Basilique.
It's both, actually, I think.
You think? Oh,
okay. I think it's a basilica too. Yeah.
Okay. and it's a very impressive.
Yeah. So can you visit that school at Saint-Denis?
I think you can visit it on les Journées du Patrimoine.
Okay.
We don't have a COVID epidemic going on.
Yes. Hopefully we'll get there, won't we?
But it's well worth it. There are cloisters, there's impressive parks, it's a very impressive building. And of course, at the time, that grandeur is part of what Napoleon is looking for. And then the second institution, which still exists, which I've actually never visited, is in Saint-Germain-des-Lacs. And now it's the collège, and people attend the lycée in Saint-Denis, whereas at the time they were, they offered each 6 years of study, sort of for 12 to 18. So.
Interesting. So are these institutions just high school, up to high school, or do they go above high school now?
Now they have des classes préparatoires.
D'accord.
So they, and so...
This is like preps. Do you have prep school in America? Like, it's usually... I bet you do in the East. Like
prep schools in the East, but they're not exactly the same, because prep schools are really to get into universities, and you attend a prep school up to 18, right?
Yeah.
Whereas these classes préparatoires really for the age 18 to 20,
right,
to get into the the institutions that are the most prestigious in France, which are not the university, but rather sort of more professional schools, l'École Polytechnique, l'École des Mines, l'École Centrale, these sorts of institutions. So it's in these classes now. There would be both men and women. And I don't think they're boarders.
Or les chartes, if you're a historian, l'École des Chartes.
Yep, there's a specific preparation for l'École des Chartes also, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting. Yeah, so maybe you can visit some, but you would have to be there on the right day.
That's right, exactly.
That's kind of difficult.
But you can admire it from a distance, and you can visit the abbey right next door.
Can you think of any school, école de garçons, école de filles that are particularly impressive from the outside in Paris? I can't think of one.
Well, I mean, the Lycée Louis le Grand.
Of course.
I mean, all of these institutions, like most of these institutions in Paris, you have impressive facades along the street, but you really need to go in and to get a sense of, the courtyards and that sort of thing. And Louis le Grand is very impressive, the whole the organization back behind. And then another institution which is no longer a teaching institution but was for girls in the 19th century is the Musée Rodin. They have those fabulous sculptures of Rodin, but it used to that property used to belong to les Dames du Sacré-Cœur, and les Dames du Sacré-Cœur were created at the beginning of the 19th century, roughly at the same time as the schools of the Legion of Honor, but they're nuns, and they direct their schools very much to the aristocracy or the high levels of the bourgeoisie, and they had a lot of money, and especially money in property, and when you visit the Musée Rodin, you need to have a little bit of imagination to imagine it filled with young aristocratic girls, but it did used to be a school.
So this is before Rodin.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
In the 19th century. Yeah. In the early part of the 19th century.
All right. Well, you've given us some great ideas of places to visit. Do you have any closing thoughts about the education of girls in France? I think eventually I have good hope that eventually there will be as many PhDs and all of that are females than males.
I mean, we're certainly moving in that direction, and then the next goal is to have that sort of equality within the teaching profession, which is something that has become a real issue in France. One of the most recent laws of higher education in 2013 said that one of the things that universities needs to do is to ensure gender equality in the environment of the university. So the French initially didn't like the idea of gender quotas, affirmative action.
Yeah.
And nonetheless, it's gone forward both in politics and in universities and in businesses, and it does work. When you have an obligation to have the same numbers, it does gradually change the situation.
Yeah, it's very funny because I have since the lockdown, I can't do that much. And so I end up talking to all the people in my village. And there's this elderly woman. She's probably 85 or something. And we talk frequently. And she was on the village council. She was one of the council members. And one day she was complaining to me that it wasn't right that they now made the poor mayor pick as many females as males. Like she said, "Oh, it's too hard, the poor mayor." And I was so I had to argue with her a little bit. I'm like, well, it's not that hard. If he tries a little bit, he will find as many women as men.
But that's really where one needs to work. It's on this sort of daily basis, sort of convincing people that yes, women can deal with politics the way men can deal with politics.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why they shouldn't, be part of the polity. And I think it's in villages where it's most difficult. I mean, that's where the number of mayors, male mayors versus female mayors, there's the greatest difference at that very local level, which does show that there's still resistance to the idea that women would be involved in politics.
Yeah. Thank you so very much. It's been lovely talking to you.
Okay.
And do you have a good book you recommend? Did you publish a book recently in English, or are all your books in French?
My most recent book in English, which I think actually is available and one can read on Google Books if you don't want to spend money, is a really fascinating book about a woman teacher who in 1830 leaves her husband and her daughter to go to Algeria and sets up the first school for Muslim girls in Algiers in 1845. And so it's it's a biography about this woman, which I deliberately wrote hoping that people would read it. So
it sounds fabulous. What is it called? What's the title of the book?
It's called A French Woman's Imperial Story. French Woman's Imperial
Oh,
Story.
it might be on Amazon, right?
It's probably on Amazon. It's unfortunately, they didn't put it in paperback, so I think it's too expensive. But it's, I think it's a book that one reads with a lot of pleasure when one doesn't have any historical background, because it's really telling a very, very interesting story about a woman who was very unusual at her time.
All right. Well, if I can find it, French Woman's not Imperial Story. Imperial Story?
Imperial Story, yeah. Madame Luce in 19th century Algeria.
Well, that would be right up my alley because my parents grew up in Algeria.
Oh, really? Well, it's
Yeah.
published with Stanford in 2013. So
Rogers. Let's see. Yes, I found it. Oh, it's on Kindle. It's very expensive, even on Kindle.
that's what I mean.
I bet it all goes to your publisher too.
Yeah. I mean, it's that's why I mentioned that it's available on Google Books.
Excellent. Thank you so very much for talking to me. And it was wonderful.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks a lot for the call.
Au revoir.
Okay, au revoir. Oui.
Again, I want to thank my patrons for supporting the show and giving back. Patrons get several exclusive rewards for doing so. You can see them at patreon.com/join us. Thank you all for supporting the show. Some of you for many years now. You are wonderful. And a shout out this week to new patrons, John Lopez, Vicky Weiss, and Sean Kennedy. Thank you so much for becoming patrons and making this podcast possible. Sean sent me a lovely note that says, "Hi Annie, I'm so happy to have found your podcast. It has been 13 years since I have visited France, but I have always had a desire to go back there, planning a trip to Paris in 2022. My first ever solo vacation." You'll be fine, Sean. And your podcast is pure inspiration. Thanks for all the amazing content and thank you for giving back, Sean. Much appreciated. Another way to support this podcast is to hire me to be your itinerary consultant. It's not a free service, but you'll get the input of a native. I've been doing a lot of those recently. It's lovely to talk to you about your future trips and help you guide, as well as explain how to adapt to travel to France as we're all trying to recover from this pandemic. To see how that all works, go to joinusinfrance.com/boutique. And this week I was doing an itinerary review with Lois, and she asked me a very good question. Should she get a museum pass? In the past, I probably would have said yes, but because it saved you time and money. But now, I'm not so sure, at least not right now. All museums in France now require timed reservations. The whole point of the museum pass was that you could flash a card and waltz right in, and you cannot do that now. So even the official website of the museum pass does not explain how to use this product right now. I'm sure it will all get sorted out, but for now, it's in flux. And that's the reality of traveling to France right now. Things are in flux and change all the time. People who listen to this podcast tend to be the type who love a well-planned trip, and I'm with you there. But right now, you can plan, you should plan, but be prepared for things to change. Take the time to visit official websites and do not rely on information from aggregators like TripAdvisor or Yelp or even things you've heard on this podcast. Get your information straight from the horse's mouth. Visiting all of these websites can be time-consuming, but it's better than showing up to a closed door. This week in French news, we're still opening up. Vaccinations are going strong. Finally, anyone over 18 can make an appointment in France. Yesterday, almost 700,000 French people got a shot, which is a new record. And by the time I post this episode, 37% of French people will have had a first shot and 17% will have had both shots. It's not as good as I'd like it to be, but it's getting there. If you go back to what I said in January or February, I was hoping that by June, vaccination would be open to everyone, and that has come true. So far, my predictions have been correct, so I'll make one more prediction. I think we'll have pretty good herd immunity in France by the end of August or September, but until then, we'll have to continue to wear masks in crowded areas. We'll still have restrictions for restaurants and museums, and other things as well. But maybe, just maybe, those will ease up a bit by the end of the summer. That is, if vaccines keep working well against variants of this virus, which so far has been the case. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel, folks. Even if you're not ready to come back to France right now, it's time to start planning your next trip to France, I think. This week, I finally started reading a book that many of you have recommended to me over the years. The first in the Bruno Chief of Police by Martin Walker. And you know what? You were right. It's good. I'm not done with the book, but it's been an enjoyable read so far. And Mr. Walker clearly knows France well. I mean, it's a novel, okay? But he knows he doesn't make some of the massive mistakes that other people do when they set their books in France. So I'll add it to my list of faves on Amazon, which you can get to if you go to joinusinfrance.com/boutique. For my personal update this week, there is a lot that's happening in my personal life. I think I've mentioned that I have tendinitis in my left shoulder. It started a few months ago when I wasn't ready to go to physical therapy because, I hadn't been vaccinated. So, I didn't want to catch COVID, okay? But now that I'm fully vaccinated, I was able to find a nice young physical therapist who's very good at explaining and knows how to get me to work as hard as I can. I spend a lot of time at the computer as a podcast producer, and I have been sitting crooked at my desk for years. It was a comfortable position, but it was really bad for my shoulder. So I go to physical therapy twice a week, and I do exercises at home 2 more times a week. My shoulder and back muscles are getting sore, but it's all for a good cause. And you may have noticed that the sound is different a little bit on this episode. My husband is starting a new job this week, and in this job, he'll have to spend a lot of time on WebEx. So he needs to move to his own space. We had been sharing an office for years, but he's now moved to his office to the guest room. He got himself a standing desk and has a nice setup. And I kept our old office, but half of the stuff that used to be in this room is gone, which is why the sound may be different. I got rid of my corner desk that had encouraged me to sit crooked, and I am now sitting up straight with my monitor at eye level like the physical therapist recommends. Well, as a matter of fact, when I'm talking to the microphone right now, I am not sitting up straight. I'm kind of crooked, but I might have to get a boom arm to fix that. We'll see. So the only being in this house who is not happy about this change is the cat. She's not sure she's okay with, she's had a heated pad on my desk for years, and she's not sure she likes me. I moved the heated pad to another spot in the room, and she doesn't like it yet, but she'll get there. She's sniffing around it, at least. The dogs are totally okay with it. They're both snoring away on their dog beds in the office right now. They're fine. The weather is warming up. I'm planning get-togethers with family and friends, and I'm planning to spend the month of July in Spain at the beach. Don't worry, I'll still produce an episode each week, but I won't do much else other than explore Catalonia and enjoy the beach. And of course, I'll go back to Paris in June for a few days, and I'm really looking forward to that. Show notes for this episode are on joinusinfrance.com/339, which, as you know, is 339, of course, where you can see a recap of what we've discussed, as well as links to relevant resources. If you enjoyed the show, introduce a friend to the podcast and show them how to listen. We're everywhere. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, Pandora. You can even ask your smart speaker to play Join Us in France. And of course, you can listen on joinusinfrance.com. Next week on the podcast, an episode about Auvillard, the gorgeous village in the Tarn-et-Garonne en Occitanie. I went to Auvillard recently and published a video for patrons. I think some of you will want to put it on your list because it's a lovely place with some striking visual, it's a beautiful medieval village in France. There you have it, and one of the best ones at that. Send questions or feedback to Annie@joinusinfrance.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you join me next time so we can look around France together. Au revoir. The Join Us in France travel podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2021 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.